Welcome everyone to the 32nd episode of Ideas and Lives, where we interview people who have compelling ideas and interesting lives. We cover the arcs of their careers, and it's always a pleasure to interview people. And fortunately, I have a wonderful colleague, Tzvi Bodie, a terrific financial economist who even today had a presentation about finance. Tzvi, say hello.
Hi there, and this is, you forgot to say, it's the Bob and Tzvi show. And we have to come up with some theme music, Bob.
Yeah, okay, I'll work on that. Well,
right.
We'll get
Yeah, I was going to say the one great thing about this is we typically are interviewing somebody who one of us knows reasonably well. So we're getting to meet each other's friends and colleagues. It's
great.
Very nice.
And an old friend of ours who sadly had passed away, but his son writes music for films. We'll get him to Amos Plesner.
Oh, he can write our theme
We'll
song.
get him to write us a little theme song.
That's great.
But until we do, we're going to go with the informal approach. And I'm delighted to that we have as our guest Diane Jones, who I've known for a number of years, probably a decade or more. And I always introduce Diane as the person that is the most effective worker I know, including me. So welcome, Diane. We're going to go through your career, so I won't tell our listeners too quickly all the things you've done, but we'll get started and we'll get to all that.
Great.
So Diane, welcome.
Thank you.
So Diane, where did you grow up, and tell us a little bit about your early family life, what your parents did, siblings, so on.
Sure. So if you're familiar with the television show, The Wonder Years, my early life was very much like that. I grew up in the 60s, and 70s. In a typical 1960s suburban tract home in one of the new communities built in the 60s, were 3 different houses. Everybody had one of 3 different houses. Blue collar neighborhood just outside of Baltimore. And in what seemed like the wonder years, my dad was an auto mechanic. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. Nobody in my family had ever gone to college. And yet it was a time when there was not such a gap in society where, those of us who were part of blue collar families felt like we were second-class citizens. And maybe it's because everybody around us was, I was surrounded by people, but, our parents, we didn't worry, did one person's parent have a better job than another, or had they gone to a better college? There were a few people in the neighborhood who were engineers at Westinghouse, and they had the bigger of the 3 models of houses. But, it was a blue collar neighborhood, and most of our parents hadn't gone to college and were raising families on blue collar jobs, which in Baltimore.
And were you the schools, the grade school and high school that you went to also in a similar vein, or was it a broader mix?
A similar vein. So in elementary school, it was really interesting. So when I was in, I guess, the 4th grade, there was a movement to open space schools. And I don't know if you remember the movement, but so everybody on my side of the street got to go to the new open space school, and everybody on the other side stayed at the traditional school. And I remember my mother being outraged that I was going to go to this open space school, and what was going to happen, and how could you hear a teacher if there were no walls? And it was a wonderful school. And one of the best things about the school is the way we learned math, and I happen to love math, the way we learned math is you went over to a cart, you pulled a folder off, you used a China pencil to do your math, you checked your own work, you erased it with a cloth, put it back, and got another folder. And so I loved it because I could just keep going in math, and I just loved it. And it would have never occurred to me to lie. But what I found out years later when we got to a traditional high school is that a whole lot of my friends had just pulled the folders and scribbled in them and given themselves a grade and put it back. So I think that was the
They
first.
probably didn't do as well in high school.
And so, yeah, and that's when it came back. So I guess that was my first realization that I can be pretty naive about some things. But so I loved this open space school. But yeah, it was a middle class. It had a middle class. It was the feeder area with one exception. The one exception was there was one neighborhood that had, that fed into the school system, and it's where Wes Unseld lived. And and my best
Wes
friend.
Unseld was a great player for the Baltimore Bullets at that time.
Exactly.
And they won an NBA championship with him playing.
And my best friend used to babysit for him. And so, so I got to go to his house. And so there was one community that had, doctors and lawyers and pharmacists and a basketball player. By high school, the majority of the kids in that neighborhood, went off to private schools. And I went to the high school that had the worst reputation in Baltimore County.
Well, was it integrated?
It was one of the first integrated schools in Baltimore, which was one of the real strengths of the school, but also one of the reasons why it was so controversial. It was at least once a year, there would be some, huge fight that would occur between neighborhoods, and they'd have to shut the school down for a few days. So it had that reputation. On the other hand, why I'm so glad I went to that high school is that we grew up in an integrated neighborhood. It never even occurred to me until I got to college that there would be such a thing as a segregated neighborhood. I mean, we all grew up together. We went to school together. There was interracial dating in my high school in the 70s and 80s, and nobody thought twice about it. It wasn't until I went away to college that I learned that maybe the rest of the world hadn't caught up with us.
Well, in particular, Boston during the 70s went through a terrible period.
Yeah, and so I think for me, long story short, I was in the choir and we did exchange trips every year, and I think I didn't really understand the full gravity of the world outside of my community until we did an exchange trip with a school in Virginia. And our choir, probably 70% of the students were African American, 30% were white. And we had a few Asian students, but it was mostly either African American or white. And so we went to Virginia to do this exchange trip, and our buses pull up and kids start getting off the bus. And we're noticing that the families that were supposed to be our host families, they were backing up, they were whispering, there was all this consternation. And we thought, what is going on? And then we realized that a lot of those families did not want African-American kids in their homes. They had never met an African-American kid. They didn't want them in their homes. And so fortunately—
Where in Virginia was this?
It was,
Probably not suburban Virginia.
Oh, no. It was further into Virginia, like maybe closer to Richmond.
Yeah.
And this was 79, 80. And
Wow.
So
That's late.
It was, but it was, pretty south into Virginia. And so it was really interesting. So, families shuffled, and there were plenty of families who were happy to host kids. And so, we all just sort of shuffled around, and, there were funny stories about, some of the families asking my friends, well, what should we buy for you to eat? These kids were like, no, whatever you eat. And it was the first time we had really seen this. But I have to say that it was a growth experience for those families because they all had big, beautiful homes. We were a blue collar neighborhood. I lived in an apartment at that point in time. My parents were divorced. I lived in an apartment. And we expected that when it was time for that high school to come and spend a week with us, that they would cancel. And they did not. And those kids came and they stayed with us in our apartments. And nobody said, I can't stay in a home because it's an African-American home. And so it was really an amazing experience because it showed us that this other part of the world existed that we didn't even know about. And B, what an experience for the people on the other side of this who had never ever even thought about entertaining somebody in their home who was African-American. So, for me, I just grew up in an integrated community. So even today, some of the things that I hear about racial tensions, they're still, they're not foreign to me. Obviously, I'm old enough that I've seen enough, but my own growing up experience, it was just, I think.
Interesting, because that's not typical for, I would not have thought that was your experience, because I remember when I went to school, of course, those same grades, it was the 50s.
Mm-hmm.
My school, this is Brooklyn, New York. There was not a single African-American kid in that school.
Well,
you went to Brooklyn Tech. You went to a technical.
No,
school.
but that's high school. But I'm talking about even before high school.
Yeah, I went to Woodlawn High School, and in fact, Erica Green from the New York Times, who wrote a scathing piece about me several years ago, which apparently she didn't write, but her editor wrote. But she actually, when she was interviewing me, when she found out I went to Woodlawn High School, she said, "Oh my God, I live near Woodlawn. I would never let my kid go there. It must have been very different when you went there." No, it actually wasn't at all very different than it is now. My mom was a single mom and we lived in an apartment, and it is true that of the kids who came from families with money, many of them went off to mostly Catholic private school. We had some other private schools, but it's very, a lot of Catholic schools in the area. And like, anybody who could sent their kid to a private school, but my mom was a single mom, and
So let's move on to beyond high school, and then you're going into college.
Mm-hmm.
Where did you go to college?
So I went to Salisbury University. That too is an interesting story. So when I was in high school, there were 900 in my graduating class. And when it got time for us to think about college, they basically had two brochures, one for the University of Maryland and one for the Community College of Baltimore County. Well, it was called Community College, both of which are fine institutions. I taught at one and worked and went to school at one eventually. But I really wanted to go away. But, again, it was a blue collar neighborhood for us. The idea of going to college is what mattered. It didn't. And by the way, my parents were very much against it. My parents were divorced by then. They both thought it was crazy. They said people didn't need to go to college, so they were not supportive or helpful. But I wanted to go away. And I was actually accepted at some really fine schools. I had, good grades and strong SAT scores, but didn't really understand, anything about school rankings. So anyway, I picked University of Delaware. It was a school I wanted to go to, and had received scholarship money, about $8,000 worth of scholarship money. My mom she couldn't afford college. There were no college savings accounts or anything. But then right before school started, I got a letter from the university saying, "Oh, sorry, we've oversubscribed. We're not really going to have that scholarship money, but your parents can take a parent loan." This was right when parent loans, they had just taken the cap off of parent loans. Well, there was no way my mother could take a loan. She wasn't. I wouldn't have asked her. So at the last minute, there I was. It was, late August, and all of a sudden I didn't have a college. Salisbury, I called Salisbury State, and they said, "Sure, we don't have room for you to live on campus, but you can come." And so I went there thinking, well, I'll go for a year or two and then move on. And I loved it. And so I stayed.
Where is it?
It's on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. So it's part of the University of Maryland system in Salisbury, Maryland, near Ocean City. My father lived there. So, of the University of Maryland system, I was attracted to it because I thought, wow, wouldn't it be interesting to go and, live where I would be near my dad and be able to see him. Didn't quite turn out exactly as I planned, but it was a nice small school. I wasn't really ready for a huge university. I wanted a small, comfortable place. I was a first generation college student. And in fact, my mother was so angry that I went to college that when I was packing up to go to college, she would not help me pack. She would not take me to the campus. Everybody else showed up, with the station wagon and their mom and dad. And I pulled up to college in my own, 1972 Pinto station wagon and moved myself. Actually, it wasn't even, in the beginning, I had to live in a hotel until, a few weeks into the semester when enough people had dropped out that a dorm room opened up.
So were you 18 years old or 17 or
I
18?
had just turned 18. Yeah.
So, so what were you mainly interested in college in terms of,
So
both academics and maybe non-academics?
yeah, so I'd always been really interested in science and math. I'd always been one of those kids. I used to bring roadkill home and dissect it on the kitchen table. And when my dad, was still living with us, we used to go fishing, and I used to love to clean the fish with him. And everything I pulled out of the fish, I would ask, what it did. And but when I told my parents I was going to go to college, they said, well, if you like science and you're going to go to college, you have to be a nurse. But I also was a pianist. And so when I first went to college, I thought, I'm going to be a piano major. And then pretty quickly realized that even though I had done a lot of performances, I wasn't good enough to be a symphony pianist. And, there's one per symphony. And so I started taking science classes. And when I took organic chemistry, I just fell in love. And so switched to be a biology chemistry major, having no idea what that meant or what I would actually do. In those days, my mom would open the Sunday paper to the want ads, they called them. And she would say, I don't see any listings in here for a biologist. What are you going to do? And so, in their world.
Organic chemistry was always considered the class that weeded out those who thought they were pre-med from those who didn't.
It weeded me out from being a chemical engineer.
And I ended up being pre-med and, had a great experience, had some wonderful faculty. And, I always tell young people thinking about college that, when you're a really dedicated student, and I was a good student, you get to be a big fish in a fairly small pond, and you get lots of opportunities that, you wouldn't otherwise get. So it was a wonderful choice for me. I'll always be glad that I went there. Although I will say that for the rest of my professional life, especially my 20 years in DC, routinely, I was asked in job interviews, well, you seem pretty smart. Why did you go to Salisbury State College? And I always say to people, I don't know, aren't you one of those people that says low-income students should go to community college or their public university to save money? Well, that was me. I had to pay for my own way through college. And a public university is all I could afford. And even at that, I had to take student loans. Our tuition was $3,500 a year. So I always say to people, I'm that student, I'm that low-income student who was on my own, not just to pay for college, but, my own health insurance. My mom moved into a 1-bedroom apartment when I went to college. So there was no going home. I was completely financially independent. And so, I did what they say poor kids should do, which is go to a public university. Got a great education, and then spent 20 years in Washington being criticized that you must not be very smart, you didn't go to a good school. And it's like, well, I did go to a great school, not an elite school, admittedly, but isn't that what you tell other people?
You should have said to them, so you went to Harvard, how come you're not smart?
Well, we'll get to this, I guess, but when I was at the Office of Science and Technology Policy, a lot of the people who reported to me, they all had MDs or PhDs from very elite schools. And Jack Marburger was the science advisor at the time, and he told me later, he said, you know, on your first day, a lot of people came to me and said, what do you mean I have to report to her? Like, she went to Salisbury State College and UMBC for graduate school. And Jack said, work for a few weeks and come back and tell me what you think. He said, and they all came back and said, yeah, she probably could have gone to a better school. You know.
So after college, you had a good time at Salisbury State, became in the end pre-med. And then what happened?
So in my third year of college, I actually got accepted to medical school in a 3+4 program. So instead of completing my senior year of college, I went off to medical school. And, you know, which really was the dream come true for me. And I had worked as a nursing assistant all through high school, all through college, just loved medicine. And the day that Challenger exploded, so I was heading back to school. I went to school in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, and I was driving up 95 to go back to school. And I heard on the radio that the Challenger had exploded, and, you know, was devastated and thought, what an awful day this is in history. And then I got to my apartment in Philadelphia and found the letter telling me that as a result of the Gramm-Rudman Act, the next $8,000 or whatever it was of my medical school loan would not be forthcoming, that the program had been put on hold and that I would not be getting, you know, the second installment of my loan. Got back to the campus, said, what am I going to do? And they said, I don't know. Did you think about joining the Navy? And I said, no, actually, because I want to have a family and I've done the math, right? I don't want to finish medical school and then have to owe the Army or the Navy 4 years. I'm proud of people who do that. I have a lot of respect for people who do that, but I'm not one of those people. And so I had to leave because the loan was gone and I couldn't turn to my family. And I couldn't get a private loan because you can't, you know, even then you couldn't get a private loan without a creditworthy cosigner. So there I was, you know, my dream come true. And I was in the top 10 of my class, but it didn't matter.
What medical school was it?
So interestingly, I have an agreement with them. I never ended up paying the full bill for my last term. And they knew I couldn't. So basically what they said is you can leave. You can never get a transcript from us. And you have to just pretend that this didn't happen. So I can't say, but it was in Philadelphia. It was quite a good school. And, you know, I think that was generous of them to say, you know, we can't let you continue. We had exams every other Friday, and literally the Friday came where they said, we can't give you your exam. Your, you know, tuition payment's too late. And at that point, you know, I already owed money for that term, but they said, you know, we'll forgive you what you owe this term, but you can't come back. So, so then not only was I stuck with the loans I had already taken for medical school, but I didn't have a college degree because I was in a 3+1 program. My undergraduate degree would have come at the end of medical school. So I had to go back to college. It was now, you know, the middle of the second term. And I went back to Salisbury State, and this is the beauty of a small school. They basically said, look, we'll just enroll you in enough courses so that you can graduate. So I just joined courses halfway through the term. I did one course basically by correspondence, which was, you know, a bizarre thing in those days. And in the end, I did graduate. I graduated with a 4.0, but I could not be named valedictorian because I had done a correspondence course so that I could graduate in time. And similarly, I should have been valedictorian of my high school class, but they would not give me that honor because I had, as Bob knows, in my senior year had decided to switch out of the academic path and into cooperative ed and do an apprenticeship and work full-time at a hospital. And so because I was not any longer in the honors program, even though I was in the top of my class, I was told that, you know, I could not be recognized because there were students who had taken real classes.
Oh, boy.
You know,
This
but
is
Don't cry for me. A lot of those people who took real classes haven't had nearly as much fun in their careers as I've had. It all worked out.
So, so now you're not in medical school. You did get your BA. Where next?
So I decided that, so this was the years when molecular biology was, new on the scene, right? It's now the, mid 1980s. And I was really fascinated by genetics and genetic engineering. And so UMBC, University of Maryland, Baltimore County, had just started a new master's program in applied molecular biology. The idea being that it was training specifically for the burgeoning biotech industry. So not a typical master's to PhD program, but an applied master's program. And so enrolled, applied, enrolled, got a scholarship, and went off to graduate school at UMBC. And on my first day, met my future husband.
Oh, boy.
Well,
Was he in the
worth
same
it.
program?
I'm sorry?
Was he in the same program?
He was in the PhD program and was in the lab right next to the lab where I was doing my research. So
Yeah.
similar, yeah,
This
same program.
this is University of Maryland, Baltimore County.
Right, Freeman.
It's
about
become a very, very good school, and very desirable by many.
Is the main campus is College Park?
It is.
Yeah, this is different county. So you got your master's at UMBC, and what was there an outlet for that?
There was.
Employers?
So my first job right out of graduate school was in a lab doing research. But in another interesting twist, while I was in college, I started my own business. I started a water quality assessment, basically a water chemistry. I went to work for another company, but then developed these protocols. And so, when people wanted to sell their home, or when a business like Purdue Industries needed to have their effluent tested, I developed methodologies and got the lab EPA certified. So as a side business while I was in college, I had done this work in basically analytical chemistry of water. And so I had been in a lab for just a few months, and I got a call saying that Baltimore County wanted to open an environmental testing lab, an analytical chemistry lab. Would I be interested? And I said yes. And it turned out that Essex Community College had space on their campus. So within a few months of graduate school, I then went to work for the community college in Baltimore County and opened one of the first analytical chemistry labs in the area to do water quality analysis, everything from homeowners who needed their water tested to some of the major projects in the Chesapeake Bay, and got to work on some really interesting technologies, that really could pick up contaminants in water. So spent some time really focused on environmental science and analytical chemistry. And then it happened to be on the campus of a community college. And, my husband was still a graduate student, and we had a baby on the way by then. We're desperately poor. And the college came to me and said, we really need an evening microbiology teacher. Do you think you'd be willing? And so I said, sure. And so I started as an adjunct faculty member teaching microbiology, and realized that I really loved teaching. And ultimately, over time, became a full-time faculty member at their sister campus, which was Catonsville Community College. And now it's one big, large community college system. But so I spent the first 10 years of my career running this lab, and then as a faculty member in biology.
Wow.
And
And
what
how many classes
level
did
was
you have
it?
to-
An elective in biology, or intro to biology, or what?
So the first term was microbiology, but my real specialty was anatomy and physiology. So I taught, and teaching at a community college, you have you teach 6 classes a
I
semester.
know, it's quite a.
And I had some semesters where I had 5 different preps across those 6 classes. So anatomy, physiology, general biology, environmental science, and then I got about $1 million from the National Science Foundation to start a biotechnology training program at the community college. It was really supposed to be an associate's degree to prepare people to go right into industry, so apprenticeship like. But interestingly, almost every student who enrolled in my program already had a bachelor's degree in biology and now needed job skills. So then once I got that grant, I started teaching genetics, molecular biology, and classes that were focused more on laboratory research.
Wow.
And
So
I had,
now you're,
I'm sorry, and I had NSF.
no, we're spinning here, but our heads are spinning. But did you find, I mean, that's a real grind. Was that what led you to your next position?
Oh, you were there for 10 years. Did they have tenure?
So that was really interesting. So the year that I was hired was the year that they eliminated tenure, but they still had promotion. And when I went for promotion, and that $1 million grant was the 3rd NSF grant I had gotten. So I had gotten quite a bit of National Science Foundation funding. And so when I went up for promotion, the first letter that I got back from the president was, we don't look at grant making and research as part of promotion. I'm like, okay, take that off the table. I've also gotten like the Faculty of the Year award by the student government. I had amazing faculty, student reviews. I mean, I was really good at that job, but it was just kind of interesting. And it turned out, I found out later, there was a fair amount of resentment among some of my colleagues that I had all this grant funding because they were afraid that because I had done that it was going to be expected of them as well. I didn't, I was so naive. I had no, when this money came, I just looked at my colleagues and said, look, let's rebuild labs. Let's get equipment for everybody. Let's all do this. And I was too naive to realize that they were like, get this out of here because we don't want it expected of us. But
and after all, you had only gone to Salisbury College.
Exactly, and didn't have a PhD. So, and in fact, the funny thing about that was the first NSF grant I wrote. So I was one of the first community college faculty members to ever get an NSF grant, and I truly was the first person with a master's degree, other than getting a graduate fellowship. And I had to get I had to get a PhD that taught at the community college to be the sign off on that grant because they would not make it to somebody who was not a PhD. So Ron Driscoll, I'll never forget, he was in the chemistry department. And I was like, sure, I'll sign off on your grant. But it's like I had to go get a permission slip from my PhD colleagues so that I could get an NSF grant. They've changed a lot since then. And ultimately, that's how I transitioned to Washington, because also ultimately NSF, came to me. I had been a reviewer for them for years, and they came to me and said, we have most of our staff here are on 2-year rotations from colleges and universities. Would you like to come to NSF to be a program director? And by then, I was also back in grad school. I was in a PhD program in cellular and molecular biology. So I have 2 kids. I'm teaching full time. I had opened a health food store, and then I got this offer from the National Science Foundation. And so I went to my PhD advisor and said, I don't know what to do. And Phil said, you know what, Diane, most faculty at this college would give their right arm to go work at NSF. You go do that, and in 2 years, come back and you can finish your PhD and life will be great. So he was very supportive. But once I got to DC, you know how it is,
There was no going back.
There's no going back, right? So I'm one of the millions of people who came to DC for 2 years and never went home, and consequently never finished my doctorate. Once I got to NSF, a whole new world was open to me, and there was no going back.
And what was happening with your husband's career?
So by then, my husband had finished his PhD, and he was on the faculty of the Uniformed Services Medical School. So he had done his postdoc at the University of Maryland, and now he was on faculty at USUS. And we had also started our own biotech company, an environmental biotech company. And so during that time, so by the time I got to the Hill, he had transitioned from his faculty role to be full-time at our biotech company. We had some inventions that were doing really, really well. But then when I went to work on Capitol Hill, which eventually is what happened. After I left NSF, I went to Capitol Hill. They said it was a conflict of interest for me to be on the science committee and for us as a married couple to own a biotech company. So we had to sell our shares. And at that point, he went to work for the FDA and had a 20-year career there and just retired. So it was all good.
So,
Yeah, but you could have been a multimillionaire with your business. So who knows?
so what?
I'm sure if you would run it.
Just money.
Exactly.
So then you went to Capitol Hill. How did that transition take place?
So when I was at the NSF, somebody came to me one day with a piece of H-1B legislation and said, we have this money coming from H-1B visa fees, and we need to start an education program in the US to try to train people in computer science and engineering so that we can justify to voters why we need more H-1B visas, because blah, blah, blah. We're eventually going to make our own and not need so many visas, right? You know, that's the whole.
You explain for our viewing audience what the H-1B visa is.
Sure. So H-1B visas are visas for, high tech workers, models, some athletes. So they are specialty visas that allow people to come and work in the US because they bring, special talent or special training and education, supposedly to fill gaps that we can't fill from our own workforce. So, it's the perpetual, we don't have enough engineers. We have to bring people in from other countries. And the way those people come often is with H-1B visas. And
it's a 3-year, but it can be extended another 3 years. It's, but you're kind of tied to the employer.
Yes.
The employer is the one that applies, and it's controversial because there have been many cases, where it's used to displace American workers, pay a lower wage to especially computer people from India, and not to pick on India, but other places as well. So companies love it, and they lobby for it on both sides of the aisle, but it's somewhat controversial.
And so you're right, and the politics of it are, because it's so controversial, a portion of the fees have to be diverted to workforce training so that politicians can say, well, sure, we're going to lift the cap now because we need these people, but by golly, we're going to use this money to train our own. So in the future, we don't have to bring in, so many people. And I see both sides of the argument. I mean, I've had some wonderful colleagues that came here, and I think we do benefit by bringing in talent from other countries. But I have also seen employers. There was a commerce report that came out probably 20 years ago called the Purple Squirrel Report, and that wasn't its official name. That's what we called it. But basically, what they said is, a lot of companies would write job descriptions describing the purple squirrel, that there was no way you could fill that job with a US worker who would have those credentials and be willing to accept an entry-level salary. But you could easily find somebody from India who would have those credentials for whom that would not be an entry-level salary. They'd be able to send money home on it. So, so I've seen both sides. I've seen that it brings incredibly talented people to the country, and yeah, it's probably been abused. But my role was,
I actually testified on it years ago with there was the issue of was there a scarcity of computer workers, and we looked at the wage growth and looked at other indicators. Didn't seem to be as much as the industry people were saying, but they had specialists in mind. So you went to work, and what were you supposed to do with the H-1B?
So they asked
Legis-
me, they asked me and one other person to come up with a new grant program that we could use at the NSF to try to train new computer scientists. So we developed the CSIMS program, Computer Science Engineering and Math Scholarships Program. So we developed this program, but it was the first time I had ever seen a piece of legislation. Because at that point in my life, about what I knew about, the legislative process was the Schoolhouse Rock song, and I'm embarrassed to admit it, but it's the truth. And so I went up to the Leg Affairs people at NSF and said, I really have never dealt with legislation. I've gotten millions of dollars in NSF funding as a faculty member, but I never once thought about where it came from. How naive of me. Can I come and do a rotation in Leg Affairs? And they said, oh no, we only take people here who have worked on the Hill. Like, okay. So I complained about it at lunch one day with a colleague. So I went on to help develop that program, and I was the lead program officer on a couple of other grant programs at NSF. But I had complained to my friend that, it was that vicious cycle of how was I ever going to get experience,
Yeah, exactly.
right? Because you have to have experience. So it wasn't too many weeks later, and that friend came back to me and he said, Diane, I have a friend who just took over. His boss is now the chairman of the House Science Committee. And they're looking for somebody to be a professional staffer, and they need somebody who is a scientist, who's done academic science, but who also has been in industry, and frankly, who gives a damn about math and science education, K through 12 and undergraduate. And there aren't a lot of mathematicians and scientists, or at least there were not in 2000, that truly cared about anything other than graduate education. But, I had taught at a community college. Some of my NSF grants were for teacher training and for high school programs. So I kind of fit the bill, right? Because we had this biotech company. I had done academic science. I actually cared a lot about math and science education. But I had no idea how Congress worked at all. My friend said, don't worry about it. Go for the interview. So I went for the interview, and I told them, I said, this is my background. I can tell you all kinds of things about science. I do not know really how a bill becomes a law. And they said, that part's easy. We can teach you that part. What we can't do is bring in somebody who knows how a bill becomes a law and teach them science. So I took the job and did not know a lot. First of all, my boss, Sherwood Boehlert, I didn't know who he was. And in fact, he goes by Sherry. So when I first had the interview, I thought it was a she. Because I was so naive. But anyway, Sherry Boehlert was an amazing, wonderful human being and boss who I just adored. I had no idea how politics worked. I really was very naive about politics. And my introduction to politics was very interesting because Sherry Boehlert is an upstate New York Republican. He's a Democrat, really, in many, many ways. Huge environmentalist. He was the chairman of the Science Committee. The ranking minority member was Ralph Hall from Texas, who was then still a Democrat. He's now a Republican. And so it was this really magical moment in time where we could get things done on the Science Committee because the Republican chair, it was a very moderate Republican, was a huge environmentalist. Like Carole King used to call the office. And then on the Democratic side, we had Ralph Hall, who was in a very different place on some of these issues. And so it was a very productive time. And I got to participate in writing 4 bills that became law in a 2-year period. Now, part of that is, I was on the Hill.
Maybe it's a record.
Well, it's certainly in
If
modern.
we get one bill through, it's a record.
Yeah, we got.
What was the content of them?
So one of them was the National Science Foundation reauthorization bill, which authorized doubling of the NSF budget. That money was never fully appropriated, but we authorized it and authorized a couple of new education programs. One was the Cybersecurity Research and Development Act. One was the Nanotechnology Research and Development Act. And sadly, the fourth one, so I and one other person was assigned to be the committee staff people to run the congressional investigation of the collapse of the World Trade Center. So I was on Capitol Hill on September 11th. And Cameron and I were asked to be the staffers who led the congressional investigation of the engineering failure, which, I actually got to go to the pit. What a horrific, horrible thing. And, but what an experience to see the sides of it that I got to see. And so the fourth piece of legislation was the National Construction Safety Team, which was modeled after the Transportation Safety Board. And it was really, hopefully never to again have to investigate the collapse of a World Trade Center. But there are oftentimes bridges that collapse or new construction. So that fourth one, and in terms of my career experiences, what a remarkable experience to navigate all of the challenges around that investigation, the engineering. I'm not an engineer, but I had to learn a lot about engineering. Not that I was the engineer. I mean, obviously we worked with NIST and others, but it was also the first time that I really worked with victims groups, which was these people had experienced horrific loss and tragedy. And I had a boss. So David Goldston was the chair, the chief of staff, who had been a reporter and was an amazing writer and made all of us be much more careful writers. And at the time, there were times when we really hated him for it. And I told him to his face, man, there were times I really hated you for this. And now I really tribute the rest of my career to what I learned under his tutelage. He was not easy, but I learned that every single word matters. And I learned it in the context of this hearing. And every single word we wrote was being scrutinized. And there were lots of emotions and passions, and it was horrific. So it was an awful experience, but changed my life, changed my career.
How did it change your career? Let's move on. We've got a lot to cover in the last 15, 20 minutes.
Yeah, I think the way it changed my career was it did make me a much more careful writer. And, for the rest of the 20 years of my career, being an articulate writer ended up being a really important part of what I did. And frankly, I then became the person who drove my staff crazy because I hung on every word the way David had told me to. And, my young staffers over time got to see why that was so important because, every word I said in the Trump administration, trust me, was used against me. So having had that training from David probably saved my life, or at least my professional life. But it just brought me into interaction, with advocacy groups and victims' rights groups, and it just. But the other thing is, it created a moment of time on Capitol Hill where we actually had bipartisanship. When those members of Congress came back on September 12th, they joined hands and sang Kumbaya, and Senator Kennedy pushed through No Child Left Behind, and legislation was flowing because in the aftermath of that tragedy, politicians really did decide that they needed to come together and work for the good of the country. And so that's why I think we had 4 bills that became law, because Congress was willing to work together. It shouldn't take a tragedy like that, but it changed the world for some period of time, for good, for bad. But there was a moment in time on Capitol Hill when people could actually get productive work done, and some of this political sniping sort of eased.
But then you ended up taking a political appointee job. How did that emerge, your work at Department of Education?
Yeah, so when I was on the Hill for 2 years. And at the time, my youngest child was in the 8th grade. And, jobs on Capitol Hill are wonderful and fascinating, but they are all consuming. I was there from 5:30 in the morning till 11 o'clock at night. The one time I would tell my son, I'll be home for your dive meet, would be the time that, something would blow up on the hill and you couldn't leave. And, I had a boss that didn't come in till 10 in the morning and stayed till midnight and, expected us to be there. So after 2 years, my youngest son was kind of starting to implode, and I realized I had to make a shift. So I was thinking about my next job, and my office mate came to me one day and he said, "Hey, I saw in this paper, Princeton University is looking for a director of government affairs." And I laughed at him. I said, "Yeah, I'm sure they want somebody from Salisbury State." And my friend said, "I'll buy you ice cream if you apply." I'm like, sure. So I applied. And so I got a call from Princeton one day from the person who would eventually be my boss. And he said, "We already have a candidate lined up, but you have a really interesting resume. Would you be willing to just meet with me to chat? I'm just really curious." So I said, sure. So I met with him, and we met like at the AAU offices, I think. And then they called me and said, "I actually want you." And I think in part because Shirley Tillman had just become president and she was a molecular biologist. And so it didn't go over really well with some of the Princeton alumni in DC who knew the other candidate. And then, surprise, we're told that candidate wasn't getting the job. And, this goofy person who went to Salisbury State College was now going to get this prime job at Princeton University. So, that made for some challenges. And so I went to work for Princeton for a few years.
But were you working in DC for them, or where were you working?
So I spent part of my time in DC. My main office was in DC, but I also spent part of my time on campus.
Okay.
Actually,
What was your responsibility?
So all of government affairs. So I was introduced to the wonderful world of higher ed lobbying. People always say she was the lobbyist for Career Education Corporation. No, actually, I wasn't. I was the lobbyist for Princeton University. But that doesn't make for a good story. So I was in charge of all their, regulatory, lobbying, government affairs, and then everybody who works for Princeton is a fundraiser. So I worked in partnership with some of the alumni affairs folks when they did activities in DC, and had the real joy of being able to be a guest lecturer in the Woodrow Wilson School. There were some faculty who I got to know, who I got to be a guest lecturer from time to time. Certainly not a full-time faculty member, but so that was really interesting. But I got a call one day. So when I was on Capitol Hill, I became very engaged in the math wars. This whole idea of K through 12 math in my mind was a disaster. A long story short, NSF was largely responsible for that disaster. I was appalled by what I found when I got to NSF. And I was really focused on what George Bush would later call, I can't remember his exact words, but he would talk about, the racism of low expectations. And, we had devastated math education, watered it down, which in my mind is just so counterproductive, and we can hold all kids to high standards. So anyway, I became very interested in math education, and Lynn Cheney apparently heard me speak. And so I had been at Princeton for a few years, and I got a call one day basically saying, "If you're willing to work twice as many hours for half as much money, have we got a job for you? We need somebody at the Office of Science and Technology Policy who's a scientist, but who also cares about math and science education." President Bush is very interested in math and science education. And, a lot of scientists talk the talk, but don't really walk the walk. Will you do it? And, had a conversation with my family, because I was going to be jumping back into the fire. By now my son's a little bit older. My oldest son was in college by now. So we decided as a family to do it. And so that's how I ended up in the Bush administration, working with many of the people who I'd worked with on the House Science Committee. They had moved over to OSTP. And so I spent a few years at OSTP. And
that's the Office
of Science and Technology. Yes, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. So it's the president's science advisor. Jack Marburger was in that role. And interestingly, his first day of work was September 11th. And he was, I think, the longest serving science advisor ever until that point. Wonderful, wonderful man. just and a Democrat, and so there was always, it was very interesting, that that office was just pummeled as being, so anti everything, and meanwhile it was led by Jack Marburger, who was a card-carrying proud Democrat, who, when he interviewed with Bush, said, "Do you know what my party is?" And George Bush said, "It doesn't matter what your party is. I need you because you're a great scientist. I don't want politics. I want science. I don't care what your party affiliation is." And so, a lot of what was said about George Bush and his science policy is just a lie. And I know, because I worked there, I worked on his energy policies. A lot of what the press said about him is just not true. But anyway, so I went to work at OSTP, and I was the deputy on the science side, so the entire science portfolio, which also included math and science education.
So you were basically nonpartisan.
Personally, I was a very nonpartisan person at the time. To be perfectly, honest, I came to Washington a Democrat. I had been an ardent Democrat until I got to Washington, and learned pretty quickly that, interestingly, what people don't understand is that Democrats talk about science much better than Republicans. Republicans actually fund it much better than Democrats, potentially for a different reason, right? Because it's in the eye of, business development. But what I found when I got to Washington is that if you really want to do good science policy and expand scientific research, it's the Republicans. And if you go back in history over and over and over, it's Republicans that fund science. And so, and Sherry really didn't care about my political affiliation and was himself very moderate. And so I went to work for a moderate Republican. And then, a lot of what I believed, I learned different, there were lots of things I believed as a citizen in Baltimore that once I got to Washington, I saw in a very different way, and eventually changed my party affiliation, and absolutely loved working for George Bush. So, but I came to Washington a Democrat, and but in my own research and digging in and learning about party positions, I really felt like my own belief system really aligned more with the Republican Party on key issues like investment in science, like parent choice when it comes to education. I homeschooled my kids. Israel, huge. I believe that Israel is a close ally and needs the support of the U.S. government, and Republicans are there. So I really changed parties based on things that were important to me were things that maybe Republicans didn't always talk about so articulately, but they certainly had strong beliefs and, directed funding in that direction.
So we're kind of running.
Do you know Tamar Jacoby?
I'm sorry, who?
Tamar
Jacoby.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
we interviewed her, and it's similar. She found it better to be a member of the Republican Party to get what she wanted done.
And not only that, so I think that one reason that I really feel strongly about the Republican Party is, I grew up poor. I grew up as one of those people that Democrats want to protect from themselves. And my feeling is, I didn't need you to protect me from myself. I needed you to give me opportunities and let me go do it. And it concerns me. And even in my roles, and we'll talk about this at the Department of Ed, I have very mixed feelings on the student loan programs, because on one hand, I know it buries people and in debt. But on the other hand, I know that when you are low income and it is your only way, when I lost my loan, I couldn't continue medical school. So I've seen both sides of that. And it's very easy for people to say, oh, the private sector will jump in. I'm like, no, they won't. 97% of private student loans have a credit-worthy cosigner. So, this is where I sort of am not in line with everybody on the Republican side, because although I think the private sector could have a role in student lending, I don't know that they will. On the other hand, the federal student loan program is an absolute, utter disaster. So, So I think that was the main reason that I became.
Well, here's where, interestingly enough, there's some commonality between you and Zvi, because not that necessarily he criticized the student loan program, but that both of you deal with guaranteed loan programs, and the pension loan pension programs guarantee, as well as that guarantee. So that would be some
Yeah, I've
interesting.
thought a lot and written a lot about the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation in particular. But, in general, people in government treat guarantees as free.
Yeah, I mean, I think when, I really believe that the big problem with the federal student loan program was when it was federalized, right? So when we had the FEL program and it was private lenders with a government guarantee, there were some checks and balances in place. And now that it's all federal, we've lost some of the protections.
Well, why? But let me press you on that. If the private sector is loaning money and it's guaranteed, what would hold them accountable to have a good loan? Is there a friction in getting the money back from the federal government, or what?
So the real issue with the guaranteed student loan program was that, lenders did have the incentive to be good servicers, because if you didn't hit a certain threshold for repayment, the government would take you off of the program, right? So you had to, at some level, be servicing customers, or you would lose your ability to be a guaranteed lender. Now, back in the day of, mail payments, I mean, I had my loans, and one of the lenders did crazy things like sit on your payment for 2 weeks so they could charge you interest, right? So I've seen bad behavior on the part of the private lenders who had guarantees. And then there were all kinds of crazy problems, like, at one point in time, the government guaranteed a 9.5% interest return. This was back in the 80s to lenders. When I took my student loans, 9.5% was free money, but some of those loans were still being made. Lenders were still getting 8.5%, except for now, the rate should be 3%. So I'm not saying that the FEL loan program was perfect, but it had the kinds of checks and balances in place that Congress could not just say, we're going to forgive all the loans. Because it's one thing to say, we're not going to collect on those loans. It's another when it is a FEL loan program, and to forgive those loans, you've actually got to pay the lender. And this big change started really when I was at the Department of Ed, because it was 2007. The slabs and SLAR market, which is student loan backed assets, would go to auction. So you're the economist, not me, but student loans got packaged and diced up and sold on secondary markets. And I'll never forget the morning I'm on the train riding to work, and somebody from Treasury called me and said, Diane, the first auction ever failed. And we knew we were in trouble. We knew that, September was coming, another round of student loans would need to be made. And we had lenders who were telling us we can't make any loans because we don't have the cash. And so Margaret Spellings worked closely with Congress. They passed legislation so that we could buy a certain number of loans from from the bank lenders to free up cash so that they could make another round of loans. The problem is the way that program got executed, the way it was carried out, it happened during the change of an administration. So it's not that either administration failed, but sometimes during the change of administration, things just get lost in translation. And this was a very difficult transition, and it got lost in translation. But that was the beginning of the real federal takeover of the federal loan program, which was then completed by the Affordable Care Act, which federalized the whole program. So I think, but I think Congress now uses the loan program as a political tool in a way that they couldn't when it was the bank-based program, because it is one thing to say we're not going to collect on your loan. It is another to pay a bank off for loans that they made. And that is a big difference. And I think that now the student loan program, it's a source of political manipulation. It's a huge amount of money. It's really.
But Diane, I want to change the subject a
Okay.
bit.
Yeah.
We don't have a whole lot of time, but I would not forgive myself if I didn't raise the issue of how we met, how you started working with me, and what your views on apprenticeship are relative to what's going on in the rest of the education training world.
Okay. Yeah, well, I love apprenticeship. Apprenticeship is something I started thinking about, frankly, back in the 80s when I did one, and then I kind of had lost track of it. And then when my youngest son was in college, he did 1 year of college and hated it. Came to me, I'm the assistant secretary of education telling everybody to go to college. And my son plops into my office one day to say, I'm quitting college. I hate it. I want to do an apprenticeship. And I watched him navigate the system to find an apprenticeship and realized it was far more difficult than finding his way to college, and really watched him thrive and thought to myself, my God, we have lost so much in this country. I mean, my dad was a mechanic. He trained through an apprenticeship. My brother-in-law is a plumber. He did an apprenticeship. I started my career as a nursing assistant, which I learned through an apprenticeship. And now I have this young son who wants to be an apprentice. And when I told people that my son left college to do an apprenticeship, people would give me their condolences. And I would say, he didn't die and he's not sick. And people would assure me that he would grow out of it and return to college. And I would say, no, I'm pretty sure that he's not going to grow out of it or return to college. This is his path. And we're really happy for him. And it made me realize that there are a whole lot of kids. I mean, so I was a first generation college student. I was going to make it easier for my kids. And so it took a little bit of the wind out of my sails when this kid who had his whole way paved for him came to me and said, I hate this. But it was a good time to look in the mirror and say, my gosh, what have we done to the young people in this country where we make them feel like they're a disappointment if they choose this other pathway? And my son, who sat in my office, knowing that I wasn't initially all that thrilled, basically looked at me and said, so here's the deal, Mom. I could waste $150,000 of your money and stay in college and party my butt off, but that's not what I want. It's a waste of my time and your money. I want to do an apprenticeship. And years later, I look back and I thought, man, that kid saved us a lot of money. How wise he was.
And what field did he apprentice in?
So initially he apprenticed in the marine technology industry, so working on boats. But then he later returned and did CAD CAM. So he's not CAD CAM, CNC. So he's a certified CNC operator. And then later he also got his 110-ton captain's license. And now he has started his own very high-end specialty woodworking business. So he's the kind of kid that when he needs a new skill, he just goes and does it. So he's done, one long apprenticeship and then other, not really apprenticeship, but shorter term training programs, and has his own business. He's 31.
Wow.
Terrific.
Congratulations. That's great.
Well, Diane came and worked with us at Urban Institute, and she set the tone for projects that are now even continuing after her, but she set the tone for it, which was to create competency-based occupational frameworks for apprenticeship. As some of you know, a lot of the companies have to do their own individual skill standards. And Diane created a wonderful methodology for creating these competency frameworks at the occupational level, so that anybody getting training in a particular occupation could, and any company using that could use that to maneuver an apprenticeship. And Diane, you did a great job, and Urban's still at it.
When
you've
did, when
gone on
did
to
that occur in your career?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
When were you at Urban?
So I was at Urban from 2015 until 2017 when I went back to join, when I joined the Trump administration. But I'm back at Urban now. I'm retired, but I'm back there as a contractor. So I am there 10 hours a week working on apprenticeship again.
So you're really not retired. You're from,
Compared to my job as the undersecretary, a 40-hour-a-week job feels like retirement. I'm only doing half that amount. So.
And I would be amiss if I didn't let you tell me about your other business.
So I loved my job as undersecretary, and I loved many, many things about it, but it was an exhausting, difficult job. And, you know, when I took the job, I knew I would be heading into retirement, but, you know, I'm 58, not really ready to do nothing retirement. And so when I left the administration, I decided I wanted to do something really creative and fun. And so I started a wedding planning and styling business. And so,
oh, wow.
so in 2022, I was the planner or stylist for 20 weddings.
Wow.
Yeah. So it got a little out of control in 2022 because of all the COVID catch up. So I did a few more weddings in 2022 that I want to do in the future. But, you know, if I could do 2 weddings a month, it's just a very happy place. It's a creative outlet. And because I'm retired, I can provide affordable. So I'm really trying to target, you know, the families that want to have a nice wedding, but don't have tens of thousands of dollars. And so I rent the decorations and I set them up myself. And so I provide, you know, very, very affordable, but, you know, beautiful weddings for people who don't want to spend 30 or 70 or
And is it-
God knows
is
we
it
need
all-
more marriages in this country. So
and
Is it all in the Washington DC area?
in Baltimore.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, in Baltimore. So yeah, so I meet wonderful people and you know, really get to be part of happy days and give people an opportunity to really enjoy the day, but not spend tens of thousands of dollars.
That's great.
well, I'm sure that our listeners and viewers view your interview with great happiness as well, having come so far and having so many interesting experiences, and you still have many years of further experiences
Now, are you
to go.
still?
Being and I don't believe in retirement, but go ahead.
No, no, absolutely not. Now, do you serve on any of Bob's apprenticeship boards? Yes. Okay.
I do. So I'm part of his new organization. Bob, you want to talk a little bit about
Well, it's called Apprenticeships for America, where we're going to try to advocate for apprenticeships at scale, and going to take advantage of Diane's experience in the world of Congress and appropriations and so on. And we're glad to have Diane as on our advisory board.
Thanks, Jeff. So that's fun. So I still get to do that. You know, I still publish papers from time to time and, you know, do a little consulting here and there, but mostly apprenticeship.
Do you employ any apprentices in your business?
So up until now, my husband would suggest that perhaps he is my apprentice because he helps me carry boxes. But the business has grown so quickly that I am thinking about bringing an apprentice on this fall. I'm at the point where I do need other help, and you know, I will not be doing this business forever. So I'd really love to bring in some young people who are interested, who can then take on the business. I mean, I have a warehouse full of rental decorations that people want to use, and so I would hate to see it not be there for people just because in a few years, you know, 5 maybe, I decide I want to really retire. So yeah, I think I will probably start an apprenticeship program. I don't know if I'll register it initially or whether I'll do a more informal. So that's something that I'm looking at is, should I register it? Should I do it informally? But yeah, that's my plan.
Good
Well,
luck.
Diane, thank you very much. This has been fascinating. And we didn't even touch a big part of your most recent career as Principal Deputy Secretary of Education and all the issues that arose there, but we'll have to have you back.
Yeah, that perhaps is hours of its own.
Well, you can do that too. You'll be our first double header.
Okay. Okay, well, thanks again. And to our listeners, we're signing off.
Thanks so much.